"Can she go instead of me?" asked the little girl. The rancher kept quiet and took them both home. Colorado Territory, 1871. The schoolhouse stood plain and square, its whitewashed boards already dimmed with dust from the road and the touch of too many hands. Inside, a ledger lay open across the teacher's desk, its ink lines sharp as fence wire, tallying names as if each child were no more than stock in a corral. The matron's pen scratched steadily, recording dates, ages, and skills. A line of orphans waited in quiet order, some too young to understand, others too old to pretend they didn't. Their silence was not born of obedience, but of the knowledge that a word might decide the rest of their lives. The air smelled of chalk and lamp oil, the heavy kind that clings to fabric and follows you long after you've stepped back into the open. Outside, wagon wheels creaked and horses shuffled against harness leather, waiting for whichever names would be chosen to ride away. It was not cruel work, not exactly, but it was a work of weighing and measuring, and such tasks never leave much room for mercy. Colter Hale stepped through the doorway, hat in hand. He was a man who needed no introduction. Everyone in Birch Draw and the reaches beyond knew him. He owned more acres than most, ran cattle enough to keep a dozen men busy, yet work his own land without fuss. Broad-shouldered, sun-browned, and quiet to the point of unsettling, Hale was a man who did not waste words. When he entered a room, it filled with a silence of a different kind, a silence you could lean against, steady as a post sunk deep in the ground. The matron rose, smoothing her skirt. "Mr. Hale, you sent word you'd be coming." He gave one short nod. His eyes went to the line of children. He searched them as a man might study horses in a corral, not for worth alone, but for endurance, for spirit, for something that might last. At the head of the line stood a small girl, no higher than his vest buttons, her hair a tangle brushed straight with more effort than success. A faded ribbon bound it back, the kind that once held shine but had been handled too many times by loving fingers. Her hand clung tightly to the wrist of the young woman beside her, older sister, surely, for the resemblance was too strong to ignore. The woman had steady gray eyes, shoulders square, and the kind of backbone hardship only straightens further. She was perhaps 20, maybe a shade more, carrying herself with the dignity of one who had learned never to expect much yet refused to bow to despair. The matron opened the ledger to a clean page, the pen poised. "Which name shall I enter for you, Mr. Hale?" Before the rancher could answer, the little girl drew a breath that shook in her chest. Her voice broke the hush, clear as the strike of a dropped coin on wood. "Can she go instead of me?" Ada Dawson, because her name came to him later, stiffened, her grip tightening. "Lila," she whispered sharply. "Hush." But the girl lifted her chin, her courage shining through the tremor in her lip. "She can sew and wash better than me. I can learn anything, but if you have to take one, take her. Then I'll find my way. I always do." The matron's throat caught. "That is not how this works, dear." Colter Hale's gaze lingered on the girl, then on her sister. He studied the ribbon in the child's hair, threadbare but carefully tied. He looked at the sister's hands, red knuckles from scrubbing, a thumbnail cracked, calluses worn deep into her fingers from years of needle and washboard. His eyes slid to the ledger, the ink waiting. The pen hovered in the matron's hand, suspended over the clean page. "Sir," she prompted. He stepped forward, stripped off his glove, and took the pen. His letters were plain, block-shaped, each one pressed with care as though cut from wood. On the first line he wrote, "Lila Dawson." He dipped again, and beneath it he wrote, "Ada Dawson." The matron blinked. "Both." He gave a single nod. Then, below their names, he signed his own, Colter Hale. His mark was firm, the ink dark, the kind of signature a man could never deny nor forget. The room grew still. The children in line leaned slightly forward, not daring to breathe. The matron pressed her lips together, unsure if what had just happened was allowed but unwilling to stop it. Ada's gray eyes darted from the paper to the men, confusion and something warmer flickering at the edges. Lila's shoulders, so small and taut, loosened all at once, and she sagged against her sister with a relief too heavy for her little frame. Hale returned the pen, tugged on his glove, and replaced his hat. His voice, when it came, was low and steady. "I'll bring them back for Sunday." It was not an explanation, nor an apology. It was simply the truth, spoken like the turning of a key. The wagon stood waiting in the dust outside. Hale lifted Lila first, hands careful under her arms as though she were fragile glass, though he knew she was built of tougher stuff. Her shoes swung once, knocking against the wheel hub. He offered his hand to Ada. She hesitated only a heartbeat before accepting, her pride quieted by necessity and perhaps by the steadiness in his grip. She climbed to the seat with as much dignity as one could muster when stepping into the unknown. Hale settled onto the plank at the front, reins loose but controlled in his hands. He gave them the seat behind him, though he could have claimed it himself. Lila leaned forward, chin resting on the seat back, eyes darting to every passing fence post, counting them beneath her breath. Ada sat straighter, watchful, her gaze fixed on the road yet wandering off into the men whose silence carried more meaning than most men's talk. "Mr. Hale," Ada said at last, careful with the name. He made no answer but tilted his head to show he was listening. "We are grateful," she said. Her voice was firm, deliberate, as though she needed him to know she did not speak lightly. He nodded, eyes on the horizon. "We can work to earn our keep," she added. "I don't take what I can't pay for." Another nod. Then, after a pause, his eyes shifted toward the gray shape following the wagon. "That mule trailing behind's called Bishop. Don't feed him from your hand. He takes more than's offered." Lila giggled, bright as a bell. "Like me," she said. For the first time that day, the corners of Calder Hale's mouth twitched upward. It wasn't quite a smile, not fully, but it was enough to light Lila's face with wonder. Ada saw it too, and though she didn't allow herself to smile outright, something eased in her expression. The prairie opened around them as the wagon creaked toward Birchdraw. The land stretched unbroken to the horizon, grasses swaying with a breath of wind, the color of gold worn down to ash. Cattle dotted the distance, dark humps slow against the vastness. Ahead, square buildings stamped themselves onto the land, a barn with straight doors, a corral fence strong, a house low and plain with a porch and a bench plane smoothed by calloused hands. The wagon wheels crunched over the last rise. Home came into view. Not theirs yet, not truly, but no less real. Hale pulled the reins, steadying the team. Ada's breath caught, though she kept her eyes forward, refusing to reveal the swell of relief and fear inside her. Lila leaned forward until her ribbon brushed Ada's cheek. "Is this it?" the girl whispered. Hale gave a single nod, his profile hard against the white sky. The wagon rolled into the yard, the sound of gravel under iron rim echoing like the last line of a chapter written in dust and silence. A beginning had been made, without speeches, without promises, only a naming twice on a ledger and a man's quiet choice that carried the weight of two lives. The wagon rolled into Birchdraw beneath a sky so wide it seemed to weigh down on the earth itself. Dust trailed behind them, settling on fence posts and the slanted roofs of outbuildings. The ranch house stood plain and square, its boards weathered but sound, a porch stretching across the front with a bench worn smooth by years of use. The corral nearby held a few restless calves, their bawling low and steady like a reminder that life here moved with its own rhythm, regardless of who came or went. Calder Hale set the brake and climbed down. He moved with the ease of a man who had built every piece of this place with his own hands, each step saying more than his words ever could. He lifted Lila first, steadying her on the ground, then offered Ada his hand again. She accepted, careful to step lightly, though her eyes flickered with the unease of stepping onto land that was not hers. Inside, the house bore the mark of Hale's way, ordered, plain, but never cold. The main room carried the scent of pine wood and faint smoke, its table scrubbed clean, a shelf lined with tin cups and a single cracked plate. A small chamber off the kitchen held a narrow bed, blankets folded neatly, and a window no bigger than a saddlebag flap. Ada paused in the doorway, her gaze lingering on the made bed. "You'll take this room," Hale said, voice even, almost quiet. Ada turned toward him. "But it's yours." He shook his head once. "Child in here. You in the loft bed. I'll sleep in the tack room." Her brows furrowed, as if she meant to argue, but his tone allowed no protest. Lila had already rushed to the bed, running her small hands over the blanket, delighted. "It's soft," she whispered, as though softness itself was rare treasure. The first days passed with a slow, steady rhythm of work. Hale did not explain much, yet his silence carried instruction. Lila trailed him like a sparrow, asking questions he never answered directly, but always showing her through the turn of a hand, the way he tied a knot, or how to scatter grain without waste. She named the skittish young colt that darted from the halter button, because, as she explained breathlessly, he keeps popping loose. Hale allowed the name without comment, though the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth betrayed approval. Button tested her, jerking against the rope, But Hale placed her small hands just so and said only, "Hold steady." When the colt finally stopped pulling, learning that patience held firmer than fear, Hale gave one short nod. "That'll do." The words, plain as they were, lit Lila's face like lantern light. She told Ada that night. "He said it to me. Not just a button. To me." Ada, in turn, found her own place in the small things that mattered. A shirt sleeve tore at the seam from Hale's work in the barn. She asked nothing, simply gathered needle and thread. Her stitches were neat, almost invisible, each pass of the needle a quiet declaration that she belonged here, not by pity but by usefulness. Hale slipped the shirt on the next morning without a word, but when he ran his thumb twice over the mended seam before heading out, Ada noticed. That small gesture rooted itself in her heart more firmly than any spoken thanks. On Sunday, they went into town. Hale drove them in his wagon, the horses steady under his reins, the road rolling dust behind them. The church bell rang faint across the prairie, calling everyone to gather. Inside the small white building, polished wood benches creaked as families sat close together. The matron was there, eyes sharp yet softening when they fell upon Lila. The service was brief, the preacher's words drifting over scripture and the promise of steadfastness. Hale stood in silence, head in hand, his head bowed as if resting in familiar shade. Lila leaned against Ada on the hard bench, tracing the wood grain with her fingertip. Content. Afterward, in the churchyard, the matron approached. She studied Ada, then Lila, her gaze measuring as it always did. "You look well," she said gently to the girl. Her attention shifted to Ada. "And you?" Ada straightened, her hand resting lightly on Lila's shoulder. She glanced toward Hale, who gave the faintest tilt of his head, as if to say, "Speak plain." "We are fed," Ada said firmly. "We have work. We are not alone." The matron's eyes shone briefly before she masked it with briskness. "Good. There will be papers soon, to make it formal." She looked at Hale as though expecting his agreement. "Next Sunday," he said, simple as ever. Town carried its whispers as they went about errands. At the mercantile, a woman murmured to her companion, "He's brought too." At the post office, a moon with polished boots remarked, "Seems quick." Another laughed, slapping Hale's shoulder. "Always did have a taste for the hard road." Hale bore it all without flinch, his silence more solid than rebuttal. Ada, lifting a sack of flour, caught the glance of a woman who eyed her without kindness, lips pressing into a line that said a roof without a ring was cause for judgment. Ada kept her gaze forward, her jaw set, carrying the flour with unshaken dignity. That night, after Lila had fallen asleep with her ribbon placed carefully on the shelf beside her bed, Ada sat at the kitchen table. The lamp burned low, casting shadows against the walls. Her hands were empty for once, folded tight before her, as if holding in what words might escape. Hale stepped in from his rounds, his hand resting on the doorframe like a moon gauging the house's breath. "Mr. Hale," Ada began, her voice steady but low. "Calder," he corrected, not unkindly. "Calder," she repeated, the name awkward in her mouth yet fitting. "People talk." "They do," he said simply. She lifted her chin, her eyes fixed on him though her fingers tightened against one another. "I will not stay where I ought not. I will not be a claim you did not intend. I will not be charity." The silence stretched, filled only by the faint tick of cooling wood. Hale's gaze held hers, steady as the earth itself. When he finally spoke, it was not with sweetness or promise, but with the same rooted strength he showed in all things. "Then you won't be. You stand here on your own feet, same as me. That's enough." Ada's breath shuddered, some knot inside her loosening though her face gave little away. She turned her eyes to the lamp flame, watching it sway with the draft. He did not press, did not seek thanks, only poured himself a cup of water and sat opposite her, his presence quiet, filling the room more surely than any speech. And so the house settled into a rhythm, not of charity or pity, but of three lives slowly weaving together, each thread distinct, yet bound by the plain strength of choice and the silent promise of belonging. By the second Sunday, town had sharpened its tongue. Birch Draw was no grand settlement, just a cluster of board-fronted shops and a church that leaned slightly with the wind, yet it carried enough voices to weigh heavy on a person's shoulders. As Ada Dawson walked beside Calder Hale through the mercantile, she felt those voices like burrs beneath cloth. A woman with her bonnet tied too tight leaned to a friend and murmured, "He's decent, but a man should choose proper." A girl her age under his roof without vows. "What's that look like to you?" The friend gave a knowing little hum, neither agreeing nor disagreeing, just feeding the fire. Ada's ears burned, but she kept her back straight. She lifted a sack of beans from the counter, her arms trembling faintly under the weight though her face betrayed nothing. Lila tugged at her sleeve, oblivious to the murmurs, asking for penny candy. Ada shook her head gently, her voice even. Not today, Lila. She stole one glance toward Hale. He stood by the counter, hat low, expression unreadable, his silence a shield as solid as a barn door. The gossip touched him like rain touches a rock. It darkened the surface but did not sink. For Ada, though, the ache lodged deep, unseen, a reminder of the ledger town kept, lines drawn between propriety and rumor, names tallied under suspicion or respect. And she knew, as much as she wished to stand untouched, that ledger would never stop tallying. The following Sunday, the schoolhouse served not for lessons but for law. The matron sat prim at her desk, her pen at the ready, while a countyman with a broom mustache shuffled papers sealed in wax. He spoke briskly, as if reciting a litany he'd repeated too many times. Guardianship of the minor child, Lila Dawson, he said, pointing to the line. If you are resolved, Mr. Hale. Calter Hale stepped forward without hesitation. His handwriting was the same as it had been the week before, plain, block letters that left no room for doubt. He signed his name with deliberate care, then set down the pen. The countyman tapped the page again. That secures the child. The elder, Ada Dawson, remains of age. She may choose her own place. He looked at Ada, his eyes sharp beneath his heavy brows. If she stays, it is her decision. Nothing binds her but her own consent. The room hushed. The matron's gaze rested on Ada, sympathetic but steady, knowing this was more than paper. Hale turned his eyes to her too, not pressing, not claiming, just waiting. Ada's hands curled at her sides. She looked at Lila, who sat swinging her legs from the bench, small face bright with trust. Then she looked at Hale, his expression quiet as always, but in that quiet lay a question far heavier than the ink on the page. She did not take the pen. Her breath caught, her chest tight, as if the weight of so many eyes would crush her voice if she dared to use it. At last she shook her head faintly, and the matron cleared her throat, moving the paper aside without comment. They left with the guardianship sealed for Lila alone. The twine-bound packet of papers lay on Ada's lap the whole wagon ride home, heavy as a stone though it weighed almost nothing. In the days that followed, the house stitched itself into something new. Hale worked the corral with his usual patience, shaving a halter block down with his knife until the wood lay smooth in his hands. He spoke little, yet his silence was never empty. Ada watched him, noting the precision, the way he worried the rough edges away rather than forcing them to break. It reminded her of how he lived, with quiet persistence, smoothing what was jagged until it fit. One afternoon he carried a chair into the house. It was plain oak, slim-backed, the grain still showing where his knife had shaped it. He set it by the window without explanation. For reading, he said. Ada touched the chair's arm lightly. I haven't the habit. You will, he answered, simple as always. She smiled faintly when he turned away, though she didn't realize she had. In the evenings, after Lila had climbed into her bed with the ribbons set neatly on the shelf beside her, Ada would sit in that chair, staring out at the dusky horizon. She had no book, not yet, but she sat all the same, finding that the chair carried its own lesson, to be still, to belong without apology. Life knitted itself together thread by thread, Lila feeding hens and naming each one, Ada mending clothes and filling the bent nail cup she'd set by the door, Hale checking the fence line as faithfully as a monk says his prayers. No grand speeches, no declarations, only small acts layered into something that began to feel like permanence. It was at dusk, one evening when the sky burned low and the calves bawled for their mothers, that Ada found her voice. Hale stood by the corral, his sleeve rolled, forearm dark with sun. He was whittling the last roughness from the halter block, shaving off what did not belong. Ada approached, her heart tightening with each step. I have been thinking, she said, her voice careful. Me too, he answered, his knife steady against the wood. You would have us stay, she said. He looked up at her then, the dying light catching his eyes. I would. Her breath shivered, but she pressed forward. As family. The words came soft, but they carried all the weight she bore, the whispers, the ledger of gossip, the ache of not belonging fully anywhere. He set down the knife, tying the halter's loose end with deliberate calm. As family, he repeated, steady as earth. She searched his face, needing more than that simple echo. "And if I say no to being your wife?" she asked, the words trembling but unflinching. "If I stand only as Ada Dawson, guardian of Lila, no more?" He tested the knot, pulling it taut. His voice was as unyielding as the rope. "Then you are Ada Dawson of Birchdraw. This house remains yours. The gate opens for you, and it closes behind you. That part does not change." Her eyes blurred, though no tears fell. The steadiness of his words struck deeper than any plea could have. She laughed softly, the sound breaking free like water from a dam. "Then yes," she whispered. "If it is a house built on such ground, then yes." He did not seize her hand in triumph, nor sweep her close. He only lifted her hand gently, turned her palm upward, and placed in it a small brass key, the one to the chest where he kept his few papers. "You laid your name where it ought to be," he said. Ada closed her fingers over the key, her chest tight with a quiet joy that felt stronger than any vow spoken beneath a steeple. She looked at him in the fading light, saw the truth written in his silence, and knew that whatever the town whispered, their lives were being written in ink deeper than any ledger's lines.